no longer fashionable traveling. There's nothing you're going to look for in Europe that you cannot achieve at home. That a lot of the traffickers who come here to tell those lies about the opportunities, the blissful life that these youngsters are going to have in Europe are not telling you the truth. There's so many of our young ones, so many of our children have died and are dying. When I read a report or watch a news item like I did 2 nights ago of a boat that capsized trying to cross from Libya to Sicily, I knew in my heart that there will be Edo boys and girls in that boat. When I read about the report of a detention center that was bombed a couple of weeks ago, and I knew that a lot of them in that, in that camp were African migrants, my heart bled because I knew that there would have been Edo people in that center. And so for those parents who have been deceived to let their children go abroad in the search of jobs, that in the search of a better life, it is all not true. Many of them who go do not make it. They do not survive. Those who survive regrets leaving home. I don't want many more to live that life of regrets. I don't want many more to make that mistake, because sometimes it could be very, very expensive. Edo had become almost synonymous with the word human trafficking. And so for us as a state, it had become embarrassing. And it was beginning to have a toll on our communities in the state. You found situations where whole communities were essentially migrating. And it was getting to a point where it had become almost a humanitarian crisis, where when you lose 10 to 20, sometimes 30,000 young men and women a year just traveling out of the States in very hazardous circumstances, looking for that greener pasture outside, that promised greener pasture. We felt it was not something or an issue which any responsible government could shy away from and not do something about. So for us as a government, despite the political risks, we knew it was not the right thing to do and we had to take action. So 2 years ago, we made a commitment that human trafficking had become, an embarrassment, a sore for us. And we came to the realization that nobody can do it for us. Nobody can eradicate human trafficking if we did not, on our own, strive to, confront it. And that's where the motivation for setting up the task force came from. I think the first solution to our problem is admitting that you have a problem. So once we admitted that human trafficking and irregular migration was a debilitating problem for us as a people and as a state, we then decided to put in place the instrumentalities to deal with the challenge. And like I said, it had gotten to a humanitarian disaster point where in a place like Libya, you had over 30,000 young men and women from Edo State who made it to Libya. So you can imagine how many who must have lost their lives on their way to Libya, all with the promise that someone was going to help them get into Europe. And we began to get concerned because of the free access the traffickers had into our communities. It had become an accepted norm. People were volunteering, and it was scary, becoming scary when you go to your community, you ask for your baba, and they say he's sold up, he's packed up, and he's traveled. They look for your child's teacher, and they say he has traveled. When we found that it was getting to that crisis level, we had no choice but as a government to now begin to look for solutions. Task force and members of our team, their dedication and passion has just been, unbelievable. And that more than anything else has led to the level of success which we have seen. The way they conceptualized the solution is also very innovative, because what they tried to do was to, through a spectrum, see the various phases of dimension the issues through various phases and solutions in each phase. The task force approach to dimension the irregular migration and human trafficking problem across 4 planes, 4 pillars, has been quite helpful. Where pillar 1 was focused on dealing with the consequences of the crisis. So for people who have already traveled, you needed to give them help. You needed to treat them with respect. For those who had to be brought back home, who had to be repatriated, or those who wanted to come back home, you had to give them an opportunity for a safe return, and then think about how to reintegrate them into their communities and their societies. So we had to think about the solutions along those planes. The next, plane was to deal with the causes. Why were these young people losing hope and believing that the solutions was outside of home? We found that they didn't have jobs. They were beginning to lose hope. They just didn't see any growth in the horizon. They didn't see the future. They didn't see economic prospects for them. And so whatever promises, no matter how false and mundane that was thrown at them, they accepted. So we had to deal in the second plane with some of those issues. How do you give more young people skills? How do you give them hope? How do you give them a sense of belonging? How do you give them a sense of a future? So we began to focus on skill acquisition, training, refurbishing our technical schools, building innovation hubs, building production hubs, creating sports arena, improving opportunities to the arts, for areas where people can pick up skills in a whole spectrum of activities. So for pillar 2, we believe that, we've set the tone. Then the last pillar is to understand that human trafficking and irregular migration cannot be divorced from our whole development issues, that they are related. If we do not improve our communities, if we do not provide infrastructure in the communities, if we do not create a sense of development, economic activities for people to be engaged in, they will leave. You have to make home feel like home. So once we looked at trafficking across this spectra, we then came up, the task force has now come up with, possible, solutions or interventions. But the good thing is that in that whole space, that whole universe, there's so many institutions and people who are already, committed, concerned, and working. So what the task force has done, which is quite innovative, is to now come up with the idea of having a round table with some spearheads. So with Edo State, the World Bank, and the EU spearheading the initiative of a round table, where we now put together or try to get everybody, or as many individuals, institutions, governments, and bodies that are interested or involved in aspects of this challenge or this problem. We try to get them together in a round table. The first one was, I think, May 23rd in 2018, and was very, very successful. Since then, we've had about 3 such roundtables, one in Benin, where, like I said, we've created a universe of interested parties in this, that are involved in that whole space of migration, regular migration, and human trafficking. The next step is to create a portal where anybody who is doing work can log into, can go into and see all the issues involved, the amount of opportunities or work or interventions that are required, and also see all that partners, other players in that same space, so that we can avoid replication, duplication, and waste of resources. It also helps us to dimension which areas to commit more resources to. For now, we are looking at resettlements, having shelters, having programs to absorb those who are returnees home and to integrate them. So there are many interventions, there are many people who are collaborating in this space, but more can be done. More resources are required. Even before more resources come, let's optimize what there is already. So that's the next phase for the task force. How do they act as a coordinating agency or a coordinating body, coordinating all the various interventions and the various players in this crowded world, in this space? 2 years ago, most of our partners were essentially complaining about the problem because there was no clear path to solving it. And what we saw was a lot of trips by foreign missions to talk about, what was going on, but there was no, action path. The task force has created that action path. So today we see people coming in to talk about concrete programs for intervention, and that is gladdening. So for us, the next phase is to leverage that consciousness that has now been created. So people now know that Edo is serious about curbing human trafficking and irregular migration. They know that Edo is committed. They've seen us put our own resources behind it. They've seen us take that political risk to deal with the issues. And as they come, we now want to be able to leverage that extra dollar or that extra resource which is now available to resolving this challenge. Our goal still remains to reduce the incidence of human trafficking and irregular migration to the barest minimum within the next 3 years. I think the last 2 years have shown that we are committed. The last 2 years has shown that we have the ability and the dedication. And the next 2 years will be one of action in which we actually go after traffickers, we restore hope in our young people, and they will not have a need to take those very hazardous and dangerous and perilous journeys through Kano, Agadez, or wherever they go through into Libya in the hope that they'll be able to get a safe crossing.